It's funny how life sometimes throws you into situations you never expected. A few months ago, if you'd told me I'd be spending a winter in the middle of nowhere, dog sitting for someone, I would have laughed. But here I am, in the snowy woods of Maine, with nothing but silence, my thoughts, and a very energetic dog named Max. Oh, I'm James, by the way. Just your average guy. I've been doing odd jobs since I left college, and dog sitting, well, it's one of those gigs that fell into my lap. A friend of mine, Tyler, had to leave town for work and couldn't take Max with him. He offered me a place to stay, a little extra cash, and Max as my company. It sounded like a good deal at the time. The cabin is about as isolated as it gets. There's no Wi-Fi, barely any cell service, and the nearest town is a good 30-minute drive away. The snow covers everything like a thick, suffocating blanket, muffling any sound. During the day, it's peaceful. At night, though, the silence feels heavier, like it's waiting for something to break it. Max and I got along well right away. He's a big, playful Labrador mix with more energy than I thought possible. We'd go for walks during the day, exploring the trails around the cabin. At night, though, I'd notice him acting different. He'd growl softly at the windows or pace around the cabin like he was restless. I chalked it up to him adjusting to a new environment. But the first night I heard it, I couldn't ignore it. A faint rustling outside, followed by what sounded like footsteps, heavy ones. I told myself it was just a deer or maybe the wind playing tricks on me. But even as I tried to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. It was a quiet night, colder than usual. The fire crackled weakly in the corner of the room as Max lay by my feet, staring at the door. His ears perked up suddenly, and he let out a low, throaty growl. I sighed, thinking he was just being overprotective again. "Come on, buddy," I said. "It's nothing. Relax." But then the growl turned into a bark, and before I could stop him, Max was at the door, scratching to get out. I grabbed his leash, figuring a quick walk might calm him down. The moment I opened the door, he bolted into the snow, dragging the leash out of my hands. "Max, get back here," I yelled, running after him. His dark shape disappeared into the trees, his barking echoing through the still night. I stumbled into the forest, calling his name over and over, my breath fogging in the icy air. Then I heard it again, those footsteps. They weren't mine, and they weren't Max's. They were deliberate, slow, and heavy, crunching through the snow not far from me. I froze, every hair on my body standing on end. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. Just the sound of the footsteps getting closer. That's when I saw it. Sitting at the base of a tree, barely visible in the dim moonlight, was a small figure. A doll, dressed in a ragged hooded cloak. Its face was carved roughly with hollow eyes that seemed to stare right at me. I couldn't explain it, but the air around me felt colder, heavier, like the forest itself was holding its breath. The footsteps stopped, and the silence that followed was deafening. I should have picked up the doll, examined it, something, but all I could think about was Max. "Max!" I shouted again, my voice cracking. There was no bark in response, no sound at all. My heart pounded as I turned and ran back toward the cabin. The image of the doll burned into my mind. I burst through the cabin door, slamming it shut behind me. My hands trembled as I fumbled with the locks, bolting every latch as if that could somehow keep the darkness outside. The quiet inside felt wrong now, as if the very walls were holding their breath. "Max," I whispered to myself, my voice breaking. The leash dangled in my hand, its frayed end a cruel reminder that he was still out there. But going back into the woods, after what I'd seen, or thought I'd seen, there was no way. I sat by the window, staring out into the blackness. The snow sparkled faintly in the moonlight, but there was no sign of movement, no footsteps, no Max. Just silence. And then I heard it. A faint bark in the distance, almost too quiet to believe. My heart leapt. "Max!" I shouted, pressing my face against the cold glass. The bark came again, closer this time, but something was wrong. It didn't sound like him. It was distorted, almost echoing like a bad recording. I tried convincing myself that it had to be Max, that he was fine and just lost, but deep down I knew better. That bark wasn't calling for help. It was calling me. To calm my nerves, I grabbed my phone and started scrolling aimlessly through old videos of Max. As I watched him chase his tail and wag his goofy smile at the camera, I felt a brief flicker of comfort. That's when I remembered. Sharing stories like this could help others who've faced the unexplained. I turned the camera on myself for a moment and said quietly, "If you've ever had an experience like this or know someone who has, please subscribe and like this video. Maybe together we can figure out what's out there." I hoped the distraction would help, but that bark outside didn't stop. The next morning, the world outside was a pristine sheet of white, untouched by human or animal. No tracks, no signs of Max. I spent hours calling for him, venturing just to the edge of the forest before fear pulled me back. Each step closer to those trees made the air feel heavier, like an invisible weight pressing against my chest. Max was gone. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut, leaving a hollow ache that I couldn't shake. I stayed at the cabin for another 2 days, hoping, praying he'd come bounding back. But the forest stayed silent. When Tyler called to check in, I couldn't bring myself to tell him the truth. I lied, saying Max had run off chasing a deer, but that I was sure he'd be back soon. Tyler sounded disappointed, but trusted me, which only made the guilt worse. The dreams started the night I returned to the city. In them, I was back in the forest, standing before that doll. Its hollow eyes stared into mine as the distorted barks of Max echoed around me. I'd wake up gasping for air, the sound of heavy footsteps fading in my ears. To this day, I still hear those barks sometimes. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. They come to me in quiet moments when the world is still and my mind drifts back to that winter. I'll never know what happened to Max, but one thing is certain. Something in those woods was watching me, and it hasn't stopped. You know, life doesn't always give you easy choices. That's why I ended up as a pet sitter. The pay was decent, and honestly, it gave me a good excuse to stay away from home. My name's Sam, by the way. I'm a 21-year-old college student, and let's just say my family situation isn't the best. A little peace and quiet, even if it meant babysitting a few cats, was worth it to me. The first time I walked into that house, I knew something was off. It wasn't just the creaky floors or the fact that it always seemed colder inside than outside. Even in summer, there was something in the air, like the house had secrets it didn't want to share. But hey, money talks, and the family paid well to have someone stay overnight with their 4 cats, Milo, Shadow, Daisy, and Peanut. I'll admit, I'd noticed some strange things before. A door creaking open on its own, a faint whisper I convinced myself was the wind, or the way one of the cats would just stare at a corner of the room like they were watching something. But I told myself it was all in my head. I'm here tonight to share what happened in that house. It's a story I've only told a handful of people before because, well, it still gives me chills. So, grab your coffee or your blanket, whatever makes you feel safe. Because this is where things get weird. It started like any other weekend. I'd packed up my bag, grabbed my laptop, and settled in for a quiet evening of Netflix with the cats. My girlfriend, Emily, wasn't thrilled about me staying there. She told me the house gave her a bad vibe, but I just laughed it off. "Babe, it's just an old house. You've been watching too many horror movies." That night, around 10 p.m., I was lying on the couch when the TV turned on by itself. At first, I thought I'd rolled over onto the remote, but it was sitting on the coffee table untouched. The screen wasn't showing anything normal, just a black and white channel filled with static. I grabbed the remote, turned it off, and brushed it off as a glitch. Minutes later, the TV turned on again. Static. This time, I unplugged it. Problem solved, right? Wrong. Not 10 minutes later, it flickered back to life. "Emily's gonna love this," I muttered to myself. She called me around that time and I told her what had happened. She was adamant. "Sam, leave. Just go back to your dorm." But I wasn't about to leave over a weird TV. "Relax," I told her. "If you're that worried, we can talk about it later. Oh, and you should totally subscribe to this channel. They've got some great scary stories. I'll show you one when I'm back. I thought the night couldn't get weirder. Then I noticed Shadow, the quietest of the cats, sitting stiff as a statue, staring at the door to the basement. That basement door had always creeped me out. It was one of those heavy wooden ones with a brass handle that looked like it hadn't been polished in decades. The family told me to ignore it. They said it was just for storage and always locked. But now, Shadow wouldn't stop staring at it, his ears pinned back like he was listening to something I couldn't hear. "Come on, Shadow," I said, trying to shoo him away. "It's just a door. Probably creaks like the rest of this house." Then I heard it. It started faint, almost like it wasn't there. A baby crying. I froze. The kind of stillness you feel when your body is telling you something's not right. The sound was soft but unmistakable, drifting up from behind that locked basement door. I laughed nervously to myself. Great. Now I'm imagining things. But the sound grew louder, more distinct. I grabbed my phone and called Emily. "Hey, you're not going to believe this, but I think I'm losing my mind," I said, pacing the living room. "What's happening now?" she asked, her voice tense. "There's a crying sound coming from the basement." She gasped. "Sam, that's not funny." "I'm not joking," I snapped. Hold on." I tiptoed closer to the door, holding my breath. The crying was still there, but as I got closer, it seemed to shift, almost like it was moving deeper into the basement. "Get out of there," Emily pleaded. "I'm serious, Sam." But I couldn't leave. Not yet. The sound stopped abruptly, leaving only an eerie silence. Shadow darted away upstairs, and I was left standing there staring at the door, my hand hovering over the handle. The rest of the night was a blur of anxiety. I didn't open the basement door. I wasn't that brave, but I couldn't stop thinking about the crying. I decided to distract myself by putting on a movie. Emily stayed on the phone with me for a while, but when she finally hung up, the silence in the house felt alive. It was almost midnight when it happened again. This time it wasn't just the crying. There were faint scratching noises too, like something or someone was trying to get out. I turned the volume up on the TV, hoping to drown it out, but the sound cut straight through. I told myself it had to be one of the cats. Maybe Milo or Daisy had gotten stuck somewhere. I went upstairs to check, and there they all were. Milo, Daisy, Shadow, and Peanut, curled up on the bed far from the basement. That's when the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The crying was back, louder now, and it was definitely coming from the basement. I grabbed a flashlight and crept downstairs. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. As I stood at the bottom of the stairs staring at the door, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Faint scratch marks on the wood. They were fresh, like they'd been made that night. I didn't sleep much after that. The cat stayed upstairs, and I stayed as far from the basement as possible. Whatever was going on, I knew one thing. I wasn't staying in that house another night. The next morning, I made up my mind. I wasn't sleeping there again. I'd finished my job feeding the cats and cleaning their litter boxes, but that was it. No more late nights. When I walked into the house for the last time, it felt different. The air was heavier, like the house knew I was planning to leave. The basement door seemed darker, almost like a shadow clung to it, even in the daylight. I hurried through my tasks, avoiding looking at the door for too long. As I emptied the litter box, I thought about calling the family to ask if they'd ever experienced anything strange here. But a part of me didn't want to know. Ignorance felt safer. By the time I left that day, I was relieved to be done. The house was behind me. At least, that's what I thought. A few weeks later, during a family dinner, I decided to share my experience. My mom and dad exchanged a look, the kind of look that says, "Should we tell him?" "What?" I asked, setting my fork down. "What aren't you telling me?" My mom hesitated, then said, "We've been to that house before." I stared at her, dumbfounded. "What are you talking about?" "It was years ago," she continued. "We knew the family that lived there before. They left in a hurry, said the house wasn't safe." "Safe? What do you mean?" My heart started racing again. They talked about noises, crying, things moving on their own. She paused, looking down at her plate. We didn't want to scare you. I sat there in silence, replaying everything in my mind. The crying, the scratches, the cats acting strange. Maybe the house had its secrets, but now it had mine too. And if I've learned one thing from all this, it's to trust your gut. If a place doesn't feel right, leave. No paycheck is worth it. I've got a story for you. One of those you hear late at night and can't stop thinking about. It happened to me and my friends not too long ago, and honestly, I still get chills just talking about it. You see, I took what seemed like an easy gig, pet sitting for a sweet little dog in this big house in upstate New York. Simple enough, right? But what started as a carefree night turned into something straight out of a horror movie. My name's Jessica, by the way, and this is my story. Jessica paused, looking at her friends in the room. I was 17 at the time, just trying to earn some extra cash. The owner of the house, a nice guy named Mr. Thompson, hired me to look after his dog, Max, while he was away for the weekend. The house was incredible, modern with big windows and this gorgeous sunroom that overlooked the backyard. Honestly, it felt like a mini vacation. Of course, I didn't want to spend the whole weekend alone, so I invited my two closest friends, Sarah, who was 22 and always up for an adventure, and Mike, 21, who brought this easygoing vibe that made everything more fun. We settled in for the evening with movies, snacks, and a few beers that Mike brought. I know, not exactly responsible, but we were just trying to have a good time. Max, the dog, was super chill, curling up on the couch with us while we laughed and joked about how fancy the house was. The night started perfectly, but if I had known what was coming, I swear I would have never opened that front door. Halfway through our second movie, the house phone rang. Weird, right? Who even uses house phones anymore? I picked it up, expecting some telemarketer, but instead I heard a man's voice. "Hello? Is this Jessica?" he asked. "Yeah," I replied, unsure of how he knew my name. "This is Joe. I found a wallet on the side of the road. It belongs to the owner of the house you're in. You need to come to the gas station off Route 7 and pick it up." Something about his voice put me on edge. It was calm, almost too calm. I'm sorry, but I can't leave the house," I said. He paused before saying, "It's important. You really need to come now." I hung up, feeling uneasy. Sarah and Mike both noticed. "What's up?" Sarah asked. I explained the call, and Mike immediately said, "No way, that sounds sketchy as hell. We're not going anywhere." We all agreed to stay put, but the phone rang again. This time Joe sounded annoyed. "I'm trying to do you a favor here," he said. "If you don't come, you might regret it." I slammed the phone down. My heart was racing, but I tried to laugh it off. "What's he gonna do? Break in?" I joked. Mike smirked. "Let him try." We decided to ignore the calls, turning the volume up on the TV. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone anymore. The clock hit 3 a.m., and we were still glued to the TV, though the uneasiness from earlier hadn't entirely faded. Max, the dog, who'd been peacefully curled up on the couch, suddenly perked up. His ears shot straight, and he started growling, low and steady, like he sensed something we couldn't. "What's up with him?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Mike shrugged, but his expression betrayed his nervousness. Then I felt it, that unmistakable feeling of being watched. My skin prickled, and I turned toward the kitchen. That's when I saw it, this shadowy figure crouched low by the cabinets. At first I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but then it moved, rifling through drawers like it was searching for something. "Guys," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "There's someone in the kitchen." Mike and Sarah froze. Sarah clutched my arm, her grip like a vice. Mike squinted, trying to see through the dim light from the TV. And then it happened. Sarah let out a sharp scream, and the figure straightened up, tall, unnervingly tall. Its eyes glowed an icy blue, piercing through the darkness like headlights on a foggy night. It turned its head slowly, deliberately, and locked its gaze on us. I couldn't breathe. None of us could move. The thing just stood there for a moment, watching us. Then, without a word, it turned and walked calmly through the sunroom's glass doors. They were open. I swear we had locked them, but they were wide open now, the curtains fluttering in the cold night air. We bolted to the doors, slamming them shut and locking them again. Max barked frantically, his barks echoing through the house. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn the lock. "What was that?" Sarah cried. Mike shook his head, pacing back and forth. "I don't know," he said, "but we need to call the cops. Now." The police arrived about 20 minutes later, though it felt like hours. 2 officers, both looking skeptical, swept through the house with flashlights. They checked every room, every corner, but found no sign of the intruder. No footprints, no fingerprints, nothing. "Well, the good news is it doesn't look like anything was stolen," one of them said. "But you said he got in through the sunroom? There's no sign of forced entry." I glanced at the door. It was locked now, just as it had been when we arrived. "I don't understand," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "He was in here. We all saw him." The officers exchanged a look but didn't say much else. They told us to stay alert and call if anything else happened. Then they left, leaving us alone in the house again. We decided to check the house ourselves, hoping to make sense of what had just happened. That's when we found the clothes, random pieces of clothing scattered in the living room, the hallway, even in the kitchen. A pair of muddy boots sat by the back door, and none of us recognized them. "That's it," Sarah said, grabbing her bag. "I'm not staying here another second." I didn't argue. None of us did. We packed up and left before sunrise, piling into Mike's car and speeding off into the early morning fog. I never went back to that house. I told Mr. Thompson what happened, and while he was sympathetic, I could tell he didn't believe me. To this day, I have no idea who or what that figure was or how it got in. All I know is that it's a night I'll never forget. "Oh, and one more thing," I say, looking directly at the camera. "If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Who knows? Maybe next time I'll tell you about the time we went camping in that haunted forest. But that's a story for another night." I need to share this story with someone, anyone, because keeping it bottled up is driving me insane. Every time I close my eyes, I see that thing. I feel the weight of its gaze, the chill of its presence. It's like I'm living in a nightmare I can't wake up from. Before I dive in, let me introduce myself. My name's Jake. I'm 24, just an ordinary guy from Denver, Colorado. Last summer, my aunt and uncle asked me to house sit while they went on vacation. "Watch the place, take care of Luna," they said. Luna's their golden retriever, sweet dog, real friendly. I thought it'd be an easy gig. Their house is in a quiet suburb on the outskirts of Boulder. It's the kind of place that looks peaceful during the day but feels eerie at night. Big, old-fashioned, with these creaky wooden floors and dimly lit hallways. Still, I figured I'd spend the weekend chilling with Luna. Maybe binge some shows. Easy money, right? When I arrived, the house seemed fine. Cozy, even. My aunt had left food in the fridge, and Luna greeted me with her wagging tail. But there was something about the guest room where I'd be staying. It had this old wardrobe, the kind you see in antique stores. It stood there, looming in the corner, almost like it was watching me. I laughed it off. "You're overthinking, Jake," I told myself. The first night was uneventful. Luna and I hung out, and I went to bed early. But as I lay there, I couldn't shake this weird feeling, like the walls had eyes. I kept glancing at the wardrobe, half expecting it to open on its own. Of course it didn't. I fell asleep, convincing myself I was just tired. The second night started the same as the first. I made dinner, played fetch with Luna, and settled on the couch to watch a movie. Around 10 p.m., Luna started acting weird. She stood at the hallway, ears perked, growling softly. "Hey, what's up, girl?" I called, but she didn't move. Her eyes were locked on something down the hall. I grabbed a flashlight and followed her gaze. The hallway was empty. Probably just the wind, I mumbled, though I wasn't so sure. Luna stayed close to me, tail stiff, growling under her breath. By the time we went to bed, I was on edge. Luna refused to leave my side, curling up at my feet instead of her usual spot by the door. I tried to ignore the wardrobe in the corner, but Luna's low growl brought my attention back to it. She was staring at it, her fur bristling. "Come on, Luna, cut it out," I whispered, trying to calm myself more than her. But she wouldn't stop. I got out of bed and walked toward the wardrobe, heart pounding. "It's nothing, just an old piece of furniture," I told myself. But then, I heard it. A faint rustling sound from inside. "Hello?" I called, instantly regretting it. No response. I reached for the handle, but my hand froze halfway. Luna barked sharply, breaking my trance. I stumbled back, grabbed my phone, and turned on the flashlight. The wardrobe was just sitting there, silent. I told myself it was my imagination, but I couldn't bring myself to open it. Instead, I pushed a chair in front of the doors and crawled back into bed, pulling the covers over my head like a scared kid. That's when I realized this wasn't going to be just another weekend job. The next evening, I tried to shake off the uneasiness from the night before. I told myself I was being ridiculous, letting an old wardrobe and a few strange noises get to me. I went about my routine: dinner, TV, fetch with Luna, but deep down I couldn't stop thinking about it. Luna was restless again, pacing the house and occasionally growling at nothing. She refused to go near the guest room, which only made me more uneasy. By the time I was ready for bed, I was already on edge. I stepped into the guest room and froze. The chair I had pushed against the wardrobe doors was tipped over. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't been in this room since the morning, and Luna certainly couldn't have done it. "Okay, Jake, breathe," I whispered to myself. I carefully stepped around the chair and picked it up, glancing nervously at the wardrobe. It stood there, unchanged, its doors shut tight. Luna padded into the room, barking sharply at the wardrobe. I knelt down to calm her, but when I looked up, I saw it. An eye, peering at me through the narrow gap between the wardrobe doors. I stumbled back, my mind racing. For a moment, I thought I was hallucinating, but then it blinked. That was it. I grabbed Luna's leash, my phone, and my keys and bolted out of the house. Luna barked frantically as we ran, her leash tugging in my hand. I didn't stop until we were standing under a streetlight, my heart pounding in my chest. Standing outside in the cool night air, I tried to calm my racing thoughts. Luna pressed against my leg, still growling softly. I stared at the house, half expecting the front door to swing open and someone, or something, to come after us. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it. When the dispatcher answered, I stammered out the details. There's someone in the house, in the wardrobe. I saw them." The dispatcher's calm voice reassured me that help was on the way. She told me to stay outside and wait for the police. While I waited, I thought about how things could have gone differently if I hadn't listened to Luna. "I don't know what I would have done without her," I muttered, stroking her fur. It was then that a thought struck me. People needed to hear this story. If only I'd seen a story like this before, maybe I wouldn't have ignored the signs. Honestly, if you're watching this and haven't subscribed to the channel yet, now's the time. Stories like this could save your life one day. Before I could think too much about it, flashing red and blue lights lit up the street. 2 officers got out of their patrol car and I waved them over. I explained everything to them, the noises, Luna's growling, and finally, the eye in the wardrobe. The officers exchanged glances, then one of them nodded. "All right, stay here with your dog," he said. "We'll check it out." I watched as they entered the house, my stomach twisting in knots. Luna stayed close to me, her eyes fixed on the front door, as if she knew the danger wasn't over yet. I stood frozen on the sidewalk, clutching Luna's leash so tightly my knuckles turned white. The police officers disappeared into the house, leaving me with nothing but the sound of my own breathing and Luna's low growls. Minutes felt like hours. I strained my ears, hoping to catch a sign, any sign of what was happening inside. Suddenly, I heard a shout from one of the officers, followed by heavy footsteps. The front door burst open, and one of the officers emerged, dragging a man in handcuffs. He looked disheveled, his clothes filthy and torn, and his wild eyes darted around like a trapped animal. "That's him," the officer said to his partner, who followed closely behind. "We found him hiding in the pantry near the kitchen." My stomach churned. The pantry? He moved from the wardrobe to the pantry? The officer nodded grimly. "He's been in the house for a while, probably since before you got here. Looks like he was sneaking around while you were asleep." I shuddered at the thought. The idea that this man had been lurking, watching, waiting. It was almost too much to process. The second officer walked over to me. "You're lucky your dog was so alert," she said, glancing at Luna. "She probably saved your life tonight." I looked down at Luna, who was still growling softly, her eyes locked on the intruder. "Yeah," I muttered, scratching her behind the ears. "She really did." After the police left, taking the intruder with them, I couldn't bring myself to go back inside the house. I sat on the curb with Luna, the night air cold against my skin. When my aunt and uncle returned the next morning, I told them everything. My aunt was horrified, clutching her chest as I described what had happened. My uncle thanked me repeatedly, promising to install better locks and security cameras. But even as they reassured me that I'd done the right thing, I couldn't shake the lingering fear. Every creak of a floorboard, every flicker of a shadow, it all felt like a reminder of how close I'd come to real danger. I glanced at Luna, who sat calmly by my side. "You're the real hero here," I said, ruffling her fur. She wagged her tail as if she knew. Reflecting on the whole ordeal, I realized how much I had taken my instincts, and Luna's, for granted. If she hadn't alerted me, who knows what could have happened. So, if you take anything away from this story, let it be this. Trust your gut, trust your pets, and stay alert. You never know what, or who, might be watching. As I finished petting Luna, I looked into the camera. Thanks for listening to my story. If you haven't already, consider subscribing to the channel. Stories like this are a reminder to always stay safe. And give your dog an extra treat tonight. You never know when they might save your life. With that, I stood up, ready to leave the memory of that terrifying weekend behind. But one thing was certain, I would never forget the eye in the wardrobe.